We know that, well, 10 years ago, the poll showed that 98% of Americans who were polled affirmed the belief in some kind of God. Now it's dropped to 95%. That's still an overwhelming majority, but we've lost 3% of theists in the last decade. But how the question is posed will determine how the answer is given. If I say, do you believe in some kind of supreme being? That's one thing. Or do you believe in some kind of higher power? Higher power, cosmic dust, celestial energy, some kind of primordial fog out of which everything comes? That's one kind of a question. The other question is, do you believe in God the Father? That is a personal God. Do you believe in Yahweh, a God who has a name and who has a personal history? That's all the difference in the world. I think if we would examine the actual behavioral patterns of our culture, we would see a culture that embraces theoretical theism. 95% believe in some kind of higher power, but practical atheism. Practical atheism means to live as if God did not exist. To live as if God does not exist. Well, when the Christian makes his initial profession of faith, he firmly declares his belief in a personal God who is our Father. And being my Father means he has an intimate relationship to me and to my life. All right, well, of all of the adjectives and descriptive terms that is used for God in the Old Testament and in later creeds, eternal, invisible, immutable, omniscient, omnipresent, and so on, when we go down to the very basic confession of the Apostles' Creed, we see that God is described, again in the earliest Roman symbol, as, I believe in God the Father Almighty. Of all of the descriptive terms that could be used about God, I wonder why it is that that one is selected for the earliest formulation. God the Father Almighty. Well, remember, in the patriarchal period in the Old Testament, the ancient traditions of Israel, God was known by several names and by several titles. The supreme name, of course, Yahweh, I am who I am. But he also was known by other names. Elohim, for example. And one that was very important in antiquity was the name El Shaddai. Again, we find in the patriarchs, Abraham, the period of Abraham, and we find it throughout the book of Job, which is set in the period, the time period of the patriarchs, time of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And this title or name for God means the one who overpowers, the one who has all strength and power. Now here, in the ancient world, there is a sense in which the term Almighty calls attention to monotheism. Why would the term Almighty be a confession of monotheism, you suppose? All right, there is no equal. Critical scholars in the 19th century developed what was called the religious historical school, and they applied a scientific principle that was widespread and very influential to the culture of Western civilization in the 19th century, and it was the concept of evolution. So often people think that the debate between Christianity and secular science focuses on biological issues about evolution. But in the 19th century, in the intellectual world, evolution became a buzzword. And it wasn't restricted to questions of biological development. But there were all sorts of evolutionary theories developing. coming out of the massively complex philosophical system of Friedrich Hegel, for example. We see it in Spencer's social Darwinianism, his view of political theory and government and so on. And it also was applied to religions. And the basic thesis was this, that everything, all patterns of life, all forms of culture, all aspects of society, whether they're biological, psychological, governmental, economic, or whatever it is, everything follows the same pattern. An upward movement of the nature of things from the simple growing up to the complex. And the theory was the same thing happened with the development of religion. So that all religion began with very simple ideas of God. And the theory was this, that religion begins with animism and then progresses to polytheism and then progresses to henotheism and then progresses to monotheism. So the theory is monotheism, the belief in one God, is something that comes very, very late in the history of the world. And the critics even said that it's late in Jewish history. It doesn't come until the 8th and 7th century prophets of Israel. They don't believe that Moses was a monotheist. They don't believe that Abraham was a monotheist, and so on. But they say, rather, it went through this same progression. Well, what's animism? Where do you find animism today?
In jungles.
Right, in primitive tribal societies, animism believes that inanimate objects like trees or turtles or, well, turtles are animated in a certain sense, but trees and rocks and so on are inhabited by spirit beings, usually of a negative inclination, demonic spirits. So that all of nature is animated. So you pray to the stone, you pray to the tree, you pray to the moon. That's the most primitive form. And then it graduates to a more sophisticated level of, instead of just having lots of separate little spirits inhabiting objects, you have a belief in many gods, like you had in the ancient world, where you have in each nation a separate god with a separate job description for some specific task. Like you have the god of war, you have the god of fertility, you have the god of hearth and home, you have the god of wisdom, you have the god of strength, the god of speed, and all of that. You have different gods. You know, the Greek gods, the Roman gods, God for everything. Then you move from polytheism to henotheism. Now, what's henotheism? That may be a new term for some of you. Is it? Okay, henotheism is sort of a transitional stage between polytheism and monotheism. Henotheism teaches the idea that there is one God for every nation who has sovereignty over a certain geographical or ethnic sphere. So that the Jews have one God, and that one God takes care of everything, war and peace and fertility and hearth and home and wisdom and so on. But he's just the God of the Jews. And next door, the Philistines have their God, who's the God over the Philistine neighborhood. But there's only one God in Philistia, one God in, they have Baal, the Canaanites have Baal, Philistines have Dagon, the Jews have Yahweh. That would be the idea, that there's one God for every people, until finally you emerge with the concept of a God who is almighty.